Everybody, good afternoon. This is Southport Armchair History, and I'm Liz Fuller from the Southport Historical Society. And I want to be sure and thank the library and the Friends of the Library for helping us spread the word about these programs. So today's topic is Southport's frontline workers and the Spanish flu. And I'm especially happy to be doing this presentation during Women's History Month and to share the stories of some of the less well-known heroes of World War I. I do want to say up front that in this presentation, I'm going to be referring to the pandemic of 1918 as the Spanish flu, and that's because that's what they commonly called it at the time. So since then, medical researchers and historians have determined that the flu did not come from Spain and that it was inaccurately and unfairly named that, and it's actually quite possible that it came from Kansas. So if you want to know more about the whole story of that previous pandemic, and you haven't seen my other presentation on Southport and the flu pandemic of 1918, be sure and watch that, and it's available on our Facebook page. So I also want to thank the Friends of the Fort Caswell Rifle Range for their help in putting together this presentation. They have done extensive research on World War I and on the local nurses of World War I. And without their research, I would not have been able to put this presentation together. And I saw Norma Eckerd, the president of the Friends of the Fort Caswell Rifle Range, is on this call, so I'll introduce her to you at the end. And can we put all the, Bob, can you put the mics on mute just individually?
So we don't know what's happening here.
I've got to get the settings. I'm not sure how you get rid of all that.
Bob, can you mute the mics? Get them. Okay. All right, I'm back. Okay. Yeah, if everybody could try and keep their mics on mute, that would really help. If you want to ask a question, that's great, take it off, but otherwise it causes background noise. Okay, so now we're going to start. Oh. All right. In April 1917, Woodrow Wilson appeared before Congress to ask them to declare war on Germany in order to keep the world safe for democracy. The war had already been raging in Europe for 3 years, but German subs had begun attacking US merchant ships, and the US could no longer retain any semblance of neutrality. What most people don't realize is how terribly unprepared for war our country was. In 1917, the US Army consisted of 100,000 active duty men with another 112,000 in the National Guard. There were only 400 nurses in the military and another 8,000 in the Red Cross Reserve. So to see how that stacked up against other countries, here's a chart showing the relative countries' military strength. The US military would have been between Belgium and Montenegro, which is one of the reasons that Germany didn't perceive us as a threat. They thought they could win the war before we could manage to pull together troops and get them sent to Europe for action. So we would have been right about there. Okay, but 2 months after war was declared, the US held a selective service registration. All men between the ages of 21 and 30 were required to register. Drafting began soon after. 2 more registrations were held in 1918 to add to the draft pool. But while the Army could and did expand the soldiers through the draft, it couldn't draft nurses. It had to rely on volunteers. Only women who volunteered went into the military, and once in the military, only women who volunteered went overseas. Now, nursing was very new to the military. There had been unofficial nurses who participated in the Civil War and contract nurses in the Spanish-American War. But the Army Nurse Corps was a new division. It had just been created in 1901, so 16 years earlier. It was created after the Army saw how important nursing was to the Spanish-American War effort. And Navy nurses were even newer, having been established in 1908, so just 9 years before the war. Since nursing was a new faction of the Army, they had no direct method of recruitment. So instead, all recruitment was through the Red Cross. So nurses who registered with the Red Cross indicated whether they would be willing to enlist in the military if needed. And then when the military asked for more nurses, the Red Cross reached out to their list and asked for volunteers. So being a Red Cross nurse didn't necessarily mean that you were part of the military, but if you were a military nurse, you were also in the Red Cross. So the Red Cross worked hard to recruit members, especially nurses. Some of it was through word of mouth, but a lot of it was through recruitment posters. And as you can see, they were not subtle. If I fail, he dies. Work for the Red Cross. And even less subtle, if you fail, he dies. Their campaign was very successful. By the end of the war, more than 20,000 nurses were serving in the military overseas, up from a beginning of 400. So Red Cross recruiting was not just limited to nurses. During World War I, over 20 million people became members of the Red Cross, and 8 million US women served as volunteers. So to be clear, that wasn't 8 million nurses. It was about 8 million volunteers and about 24,000 military nurses. So you could be a member of the Red Cross where you gave money, you could be a volunteer, and you could be a nurse. So the other members they were volunteers, they were donors. They gave donations of approximately $400 million in money and materials to support the war effort. In addition, volunteers rolled bandages and put together care packages. They donated books and stationery and supplies for the soldiers in stateside camps. They sent food to the soldiers at home and overseas. They sent clothes to refugees in Europe, and they knitted socks and hats for the soldiers. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I have to say Southport overshot their money target. Like they had a target of how much Southport was expected to give, and they gave more. And I think it averaged out to $30 per every individual in Southport, which was a lot. There was very much a feeling of patriotism and a desire to help from almost all women in the United States. In Southport, there were 2 Red Crosses, one in the white community and one in the black. The Black Red Cross helped out on Selective Service Day, and they registered Black men for the draft. In the white community, the Southport Women's Club helped register the white men. By March of 1918, the white Southport Red Cross had 300 members, which is astounding considering the size of the town. So here's some of the local Southport women who trained as volunteer Red Cross nurses. Now they were not heading overseas, but they could help out locally with first aid and backfilling for the nurses who had left the country. So about 1/3 of US nurses did go overseas, leaving a gap back home. So one of the military nurses that went overseas was from Southport. She was a woman named Susan Adkins Williams. Susan, known locally as Miss Susie, was born in Southport in 1879, and her family lived in this house on Nash Street. Now, Susan's family had deep ties to Southport. Her father was a veteran of the Confederate Army, a river pilot, and he had served as a Southport alderman. And he was an influential businessman in Southport. So this photo is a meeting of Confederate war veterans from Brunswick County. So it's possible her father was one of the men in this group, but we don't know for sure. Susan's mother's family also had deep connections in Southport. She was an Adkins, the sister of Captain J.J. Adkins and Captain E.H. Adkins, who were both Cape Fear River pilots. So this house belonged to her brother, Captain J.J. Adkins, and his wife. And you can see where her aunt and uncle's house is positioned on Bay Street and Davis Street near the garrison. So her other uncle, Captain E.H. Adkins, and his wife, Lottie, lived across the street from Susie and her family. So this is Lord and Nash Street. Their house might be familiar to you as it's now a bed and breakfast known as the Robert Ruark Inn. So Robert Ruark was the grandson of Susie's uncle, Captain Adkins. So the man who lived in that big house, it was his grandson. He was also a celebrated novelist. So Ruark memorialized his grandfather, who lived in that house, in his autobiographical novel called The Old Man and the Boy. So as her uncle's grandson, Ruark was Miss Susie's cousin. So her cousin was known for his adventurous lifestyle, which he documented in his books and magazine articles. And that adventurous streak must have run through the Adkins side of the family, because when the opportunity arose, Miss Susie didn't pass up a chance at adventure. As a young woman, Susie moved all the way from Southport to Brooklyn, New York, where she attended the Long Island Nursing College. At the age of 29, she graduated with high honors, and this is her graduation notice that was put in the paper along with an article saying that she had graduated with high honors. And then this is the hospital where she attended school and later worked. It was 8 stories high and is considered the first skyscraper hospital in the world. After graduation, she rented a room in a boarding house and worked as a private nurse in Brooklyn. Shortly, whoops. Oh, I'm missing a page. So let me just tell you, her mother got sick and developed stomach cancer. And so Susie came back to Southport and she nursed her mother until she passed away. And I don't know what happened to her, her picture. So anyway, she did that. She took care of her mother and then she passed away. And then shortly after her, shortly after her mother died, a call went out for nurses overseas. France and England were begging for nurses, but with the war going on, they couldn't afford to take just anyone. They needed nurses who could hit the ground running and actually be of help without a lot of training. So they requested graduate nurses like Susie. And so at the age of 38, Susie's adventurous nature called to her again. She left Southport and she returned to Brooklyn, where she promptly volunteered with the Red Cross, indicating that if her country needed her, she would come. So just about that time, a Brooklyn-based nurse named Frances Van Ingen was frantically looking for well-trained, unattached nurses who could drop everything and leave immediately for France. She was putting together the staff for the first Navy hospital in France, where she would be head nurse. Van Ingen had been chosen to head this camp because of her education and experience. She was a graduate of the Brooklyn School of Nursing. Only 6 months after the war broke out in Europe, she had joined a Red Cross unit stationed in northern France. She was part of a 10-nurse unit sent over from the United States to join existing British medical staff. And there she nursed British, French, and Belgian soldiers in a hospital converted from a boys' school. She stayed on at that hospital for a year, working from February 1915 until her return to New York aboard this ship, the SS España, in February 1916. So now it had been a year and a half and she was heading back to France, and this time with the American Navy Nurse Corps, so part of the Navy. And she was going to be chief nurse of Navy Base Hospital No. 1 in Brest, France. So although we don't have a photo of Van Ingen, we do have a photo of the trench coat and hat she wore during her time as a nurse with the Navy Nurse Corps in World War I, both of which are on display in the Smithsonian. So it may seem kind of random to look at her trench coat, but this was a very important item for Nurse Van Ingen. According to the donation paperwork, this trench coat was used as a coat by day and a covering by night. So they must have used that if they were out in the cold, they didn't have enough blankets, or they needed to be protected from rain. Trench coats were so useful to nurses during the war that many described them as their closest friend. Van Ingen maintained a diary during her time in the Navy. Her entries are an invaluable source of information about the life of Navy nurses. She wrote about her assignment to staff the first Navy hospital in France, and this is where she recruited Susie. She says, at noon on September 11th, while I was stationed at the United States Navy Hospital in Brooklyn, the commanding officer told me to have 40 nurses ready to sail for France in 2 days. It's still hazy in my mind just what did happen during those 2 days. Kind people helped me phone, others loaned their automobiles or ran errands themselves. The Red Cross stretched forth its mighty arm and the full equipment, including the uniforms, appeared. So what Nurse Van Ingen is saying here is that in addition to helping supplying the nurses, it was the Red Cross who supplied the uniforms. The Army did not have the capacity to produce all those uniforms. So in many instances, it was the Red Cross that provided them. And it wasn't until 1922, 3 years after the war ended, that the Red Cross was reimbursed for their expenses. So originally the nurse uniforms were supposed to be white, but in France it was almost impossible to keep white uniforms clean. So instead they switched to gray uniforms with white aprons, cuffs, collars, and caps, which were a little easier to keep clean. Plus they could have multiple caps and multiple cuffs that they could interchange and keep their uniform looking nicer longer. Their outside coat and uniform were supposed to be olive drab green, a wool fabric, just like the soldiers wore. But all of that fabric was going to make uniforms for the soldiers, and there was a shortage. So nurse uniforms were changed to a dark navy blue, which has now come to be associated with nurses. So Van Ingen's diary entry continues. On September 14th, 1917, the unit left Grand Central Station. It was early enough in the war for our uniforms to be new to the public. So they must have turned a lot of heads as they were walking along. A regular officer of the Navy, Dr. L.S. von Wendekund, who you see there, with Dr. Vickery, took charge of the unit. Our destination was the Navy Yard at Philadelphia. So that's showing that there. It's not very glamorous looking. And we walked from the train to the USS Henderson. It was the first time officers and crew had ever had women traveling with them, and the nurses found things as interesting as the crew found us. Oh, there we go. The following Sunday evening, the 6th Division of Marines came aboard, about 1,500 men under Major Hughes. Comparatively few of this division lived to come back. 2/3 of the officers were killed. After the armistice, Colonel Hughes passed through our hospital on crutches on his way back to the United States, a mere shadow of his former vigorous self. So here's her entry from the morning that when the ship pulled out. She says, Monday morning, we slipped from our moorings out between the men of war. In our convoy was the cruiser San Diego with its great observation balloon, which was up most of the time, 2 destroyers, a tanker, and 2 transports, the Finland and the Antilles. So what she's talking about is that the ships were traveling in a convoy to make them safer from submarines. When a ship was traveling by itself, it was a more of a target from submarines than when they were in a whole group. And they would move across the ocean in a zigzag pattern, which also made it harder for the submarines to target them, but it also made their progress slower. So imagine how that must have been for Nurse Susie and the other nurses. One day they were working as nurses in private hospitals, and then the next they're informed that they had been selected to join the military and head overseas. They had almost no time to make a decision about what to do, let alone say goodbye to their family and their friends. They had to scramble to find a way to secure their belongings, to keep them safe until their return, to give notice to their jobs and their landlords, to cancel their bills, their magazine subscriptions, to gather their important papers together, to find new homes for their pets, just to leave everything and everyone they had ever known. And then within 2 days, they were on a ship on the ocean, heading off to war, surrounded by strangers. Some of the girls had never been away from home before. Miss Susie had at least had the opportunity to travel a little in her life, having moved from Southport to Brooklyn. And she had spent some time living on her own in a boarding house. But in many ways, she was still just a girl from Southport, heading off alone to a great big war in Europe. So Nurse Susie and the other women arrived in a foreign country that had been devastated by war for several years. They didn't know the language or the customs or the area. And even though they were experienced nurses, they had no experience in the military or the military way of getting things done. So in this picture, these are the actual nurses from that hospital. I counted up, and I think there's about 27 nurses here. There were 40 in the original group. So we have a little better than 50-50 chance that one of these nurses is Nurse Susie, but we don't know which one. Van Ingen's diary entries give many details of their grueling experience at the base hospital. It had inefficient heat, inefficient water, there was a cesspool, there were numerous mice and rats and maggots and flies, and just unsanitary operating conditions. The main building of the hospital, which you can see here, was 4 stories, so that required multiple flights of carrying stretchers and food and water and coal and excrement. She also writes of serving in field hospitals at the front lines and of experiencing gas attacks. So despite her challenging circumstances, Nurse Susie wrote home to Southport, and she told them to be sure and let her know of any Brunswick County boys who were sent to France so that she could look after them with particular interest and care if need be. If Susie and the other nurses needed any confirmation that they were putting themselves at great personal risk, they only needed to hear of the plight of their ship convoy as it made its return trip to the United States. Despite taking all the same precautions they had taken on the way out, their convoy was attacked by a German U-boat. The Antilles, one of the ships that traveled with them, was torpedoed, and 67 lives were lost. That loss of life was the first case in the war involving a large number of American casualties. This attack could just as easily have happened on the convoy's trip to France, and Nurse Susie could have been one of the lives that was lost. So 2 months later, in November 1917, the Southport Women's Club packed a Christmas box to send to Nurse Susie in France. And I was really pleased to see that Southport was remembering this poor motherless girl who had relocated to Brooklyn before heading overseas. And although I'm sure that it helped that her aunt was the treasurer of the Civic Club. So the fact that they were sending this box was written up in the newspaper, and I was really excited for her, and I imagined how pleased she'd be with all the sorts of wonderful treats from home. So I was a little bit disappointed when I looked in the minutes of the Women's Club and discovered that they had decided to send handkerchiefs. I'm sure handkerchiefs were very useful, especially in a time before Kleenex had been invented, and I'm sure that they were very much appreciated by Nurse Susie. I was the one who was a little bit let down. And I don't know what I expected to be in the box, but not just the handkerchiefs. So I'm hoping that maybe with the handkerchiefs, they included maybe some cheerful little notes and cards and letters and some candy or something. So Chief Nurse Van Ingen continued to document their experience in the war. She wrote about the heartbreak of some of the US troops arriving in France already too ill to join the fight. So in December 1917, she wrote, "Our most serious cases were the measles and meningitis, especially the measles cases coming from the transports. The transporting of them from the ships to the hospital proved fatal to many." So what she's talking about is these were men arriving from the US who already were sick with measles or meningitis. It's likely they hadn't shown any symptoms before they got on the ship. It took a week and a half or so to get across the water. Or somebody might have had it when they came on board, and then they passed it to some of the other men on board because it was very crowded conditions and people were coming from all over. They didn't have a natural immunity to the germs that were being brought on board. So then she just saw all of these people being sick. She said they were carried from the ship to the lighter, from the lighter to the dock, from the dock to the ambulance, and from the ambulance to the hospital. It sometimes took from 6 to 8 hours to accomplish this. She said at this time, those lighters were just uncovered boats, mere barges, so that these sick boys were exposed for hours to the cold and the rain. So it's interesting that Nurse Van Ingen was writing about the loss of life due to measles in December of 1917, because at the same time, back at Southport, Colonel Chase, who was the commander of Fort Caswell, was fighting his own battle with the measles outbreak. So it appears that there was a concern over a measles outbreak in Wilmington. So the colonel declared a quarantine for Caswell soldiers. They were not allowed to travel to Wilmington. And this caused quite an uproar among the families of Wilmington who wouldn't be able to see their sons at Christmas, because this was about a week before Christmas. So as you can imagine, Colonel Chase was trying hard to keep the boys safe, knowing that if they shipped out and then came down with measles, it's likely they wouldn't survive. But it's just another example of the challenges in public health administration of trying to safeguard citizens from dangers while also trying to allow for their personal freedoms. So in this case, the soldiers were used to following orders, but their parents, especially their mothers, were not. So Fort Caswell had been one of the first locations in North Carolina to receive troops because it was already an existing camp. The first men to be sent there were the National Guard, and they were followed very quickly by new recruits. These are the barracks for the enlisted men. Now, the fort was built to accommodate about 450 men. The average amount stationed at the camp during World War I was between 1,200 and 1,500, so several times the amount it was built to hold. The overflow were put into tents until more barracks could be built. In the summer, they dealt with heat and snakes and mosquitoes and sand spurs. And the winter wasn't any better. The winter of 1918 was one of the coldest that was then on record in North Carolina. So the tents were heated with these, they were called them Sibley stoves, and they were left over from the Civil War. This is the headquarters, and then the hospital is the building in the back. And these are the newly formed troops who until recently had just been regular working Joes. These particular troops that you see are lucky because they have uniforms. The very first troops to come through were asked to bring some tan pants and some boots if possible. And if they couldn't afford those, they were asked to at least bring a change of pants and some underwear and socks because it would be at least 2 weeks before their uniforms got there. Now, I recently learned of some letters written by a soldier named Russell Ernst, who was stationed at Fort Caswell for the first half of 1918. And these letters are in the North Carolina State Archives. He wrote these letters to his dear friend, Helen Petty. And in one letter, he described some of the challenges of serving on Oak Island. He said, he wrote, "I guess that I'll have to spend my summer here among the sand spurs, fleas, and gnats. If I do, I shall have to learn some new cuss words from someone, for my present vocabulary is entirely inadequate to express my sentiments when I'm standing at attention during guard mount or parade with about 27 million gnats in my eyes and ears and a similar amount of sand fleas working into my shoes and leggings." So there's some insight into what life was like for the soldiers. Because the U.S. had committed to build up its troop presence so quickly, there was an urgency about the soldiers' stay at Fort Caswell that year. They were desperately needed on the battlefields of Europe. Therefore, the training had to be hurried and intense. Because of the rushed experiences, the men weren't always fully prepared for what lay ahead of them in Europe. Of course, the government was continually doing whatever it could to improve the training of the troops. In January of 1918, the United States War Department proposed the construction of a rifle range adjacent to Fort Caswell to be used for small arms training of soldiers destined for overseas duty. So this is not a picture from the Fort Caswell rifle range, but it's one that's very similar. And the targets you can see in the background are on a mechanism that's operated by a soldier who's down in a protective pit, trying not to get shot. He would cause the targets to move up and down to make them more challenging to hit. And then armed soldiers who were several hundred yards away north of the structure would then attempt to shoot the targets. So in another letter to Helen, Russell Ernst described his own experiences after spending a couple of days training recruits on a rifle range at Fort Caswell. He wrote, "Just at present, my head feels like it might be as large as a barrel, and my ears ring like fire bells. Have been on the rifle range for 2 days trying to teach a bunch of rookies how to shoot, and the continual banging of their guns in my ear has temporarily deafened me until I can scarcely hear a person speak in an ordinary tone of voice. We'll finish up tomorrow and surely we'll be glad of it." So I hadn't thought about it, but when you look at this picture of these men at the rifle range, they were just wearing their regular hats. They're not wearing any kind of safety equipment over their ears like you wear at gun ranges now. So that would cause a lot of pain and hearing loss. He also shared with Helen his own scores and target practice on the rifle range and with some of the artillery, and apparently his scores were pretty good because he was proud of them. Now, Ernst was born in Ohio, but he grew up in South Carolina, and then he'd been living in Asheville, North Carolina for a few years, and that's where he enlisted from. So he didn't really consider himself being from North Carolina. And he said about his scores, he said, "Not so bad, I think, when you consider that I am shooting against a bunch of mountaineer moonshiners and hunters who are noted in history and fiction for their shooting. You see, my company is recruited from Henderson, Polk, and Transylvania counties in North Carolina, and those counties are noted for their wild and woolly inhabitants." Okay, so during World War I, there was no real way to get between Fort Caswell and Southport by land, and there were no bridges. So the government ran a steamer called the Getty, which transported the troops to Southport whenever they were off duty, which was usually Sundays and one evening a week. So imagine what it was like for this small fishing village to become a military town overnight. There were as many troops at Caswell as there were men, women, and children combined in Southport. The soldiers were young, they were away from home for the first time, and they were preparing to go overseas to fight a foreign war. Many would not come home. When they had liberty, they wanted ways to amuse, distract, and comfort themselves. Southport was a dry town in a dry county, although there were some pockets of moonshining. But imagine how worried the leaders of the town and the mothers of the town must have been about what kind of element this was going to attract: gambling, alcohol, and loose women. And I found it interesting enough that it wasn't just the mothers in Southport who were concerned. It was the mothers of the boys being sent off to war who were worried as well. They were concerned not just about their sons' physical safety, but about their moral and spiritual safety as well. So the citizens of Southport set up an Army-Navy club on Nash Street. The Masons turned the first floor of their lodge over to the club. The Red Cross collected and donated furniture, decorations, games, a Victrola, and records. You can see a piano in the corner, and there's plenty of stationery for writing the folks back home. There was a canteen run by the Red Cross that sold sandwiches and cakes at low prices, and local women and young ladies signed up to volunteer as hostesses. There was a stage for presentations and performances. The town built a bowling alley and a gym in the back. They built a bandstand next door for musical entertainment. And in the few months that the boys spent at Fort Caswell, the people of Southport did all that they could to make them feel welcome and appreciated, including inviting them into their homes for home-cooked meals and providing support and advice and kind of acting as stand-in parents. And before they shipped out, the soldiers made it a point to get their pictures taken on the steps of the Army-Navy Club. It had become a tradition that was thought to bring them luck. For the first 9 months, there were no nurses at the fort. The military doctors and the hospital corpsmen provided any medical care that they required. With 1,200 men at the base, it's likely there were a fair share of injuries and accidents and illnesses. There might have been a few broken bones, sprained ankles, or severe sunburns. Then, in just a few weeks, starting in February 1918, there were 3 recruits that died: one of meningitis, one of tuberculosis, and an 18-year-old boy who died of pneumonia. It was thought that the young men were already sick before they arrived at the camp. Perhaps they were in an early stage of their illness and it had gone unnoticed. The procedure at Fort Caswell was that new recruits were initially isolated from the rest of the population. And this measure probably saved lives, as no one else caught their diseases. But the deaths of these 3 young men left the Caswell soldiers shaken. And this anxiety was evidenced in Russell Ernst's letters to Helen. So here's an excerpt of a letter he wrote the day after the 3rd man died. He said, "We've had several deaths on the post recently among the recruits. They brought everything from hydrophobia to toothache with them. I wish they'd been kept away from here, for our health record was fine until they came." So it may sound like Ernst lacked compassion for his fellow soldiers' plights, but I think it was his way of letting Helen know that he was scared that he could die in battle or of disease. And since it was much more common for soldiers to die of disease than war wounds, it was a real concern. But at least by being in a training camp for a few months, Ernst and the other soldiers had time to get familiar with the idea of being in the military and with the military way of life before they were sent overseas. As you recall, Nurse Susie and the other nurses were just thrust into the war front with almost no preparation or lead time. They had the culture shock of being at war, of being in France, of being in the military, all happening all at once. And once they got to their hospital camp in France, they discovered that real life didn't always look the same as it did on the recruitment posters. So after a while, the military realized that the transition for the nurses could go more smoothly if they could at least train the nurses to the military way of doing things before sending them overseas. And then things would feel more familiar once they arrived. So in March 1918, the military began sending the first nurses to cantonment camps like Caswell for military training before sending them along overseas. So it was at this time that the first nurses arrived at Fort Caswell. And I like this picture that you're seeing because in my mind, that's, you know, as the nurses came across in the boat, they were brought across to the camp. This is how I envision what they first saw of their new home and what it looked like. So the first nurse to arrive was Nellie Davis, who would be the chief nurse at Caswell. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that when the US declared war in Germany, we had very few soldiers and even fewer nurses. There were about 400 nurses in the military, and Nellie was one of those elite few. She was originally from Denver, and she attended nursing school at St. Joseph's Hospital there, and she graduated in 1907 when she was 23 years old. She joined the Army in 1916, about 6 months before the war started. Perhaps she saw what was coming and she wanted to be a part of it. She was assigned to Letterman Hospital in San Francisco, which was one of only 4 sites in the country that nurses were assigned to. And you can see the picture of it there. Letterman was a very large hospital with many departments and facilities. And Nellie would have gotten a lot of training and experience during her time there. After the war started, she was sent to Camp Jackson in South Carolina to serve as chief nurse. Now, this was a brand new camp built to train recruits before sending them overseas. And there were between 30,000 and 45,000 soldiers at the camp. So then in March 1918, she was sent to Fort Caswell to become the chief nurse there. She was tasked with setting up a nursing program to care for the troops and to train new nurses about the Army way of nursing. She arrived on March 16th, and she had only 4 days to get ready with the base and set things up, get familiar with the base, get everything ready before her staff arrived. Chief Nurse Nellie had 6 nurses on her team, all brand new recruits who had heard the call of the military and wanted to serve. Now, these women were new to the Army, but they were not new to nursing. They all had degrees in nursing from large hospitals. And in addition, the nurses had other things in common. They were all young, they were all single, they were all white American women. And this was no coincidence. The requirements for nurses at the time were that they be female US citizens between the ages of 21 and 45. Now, the requirements didn't necessarily specifically list race. However, that restriction was embedded in the requirement that they must have graduated from a nursing facility with more than 50 beds. African-American nurses tended to go to smaller segregated schools in the South, and in the North, where there were larger schools, their enrollment was limited by quotas. So by requiring that the nurses' training be from larger schools, the military was in effect limiting the participation of African-Americans. And the official reason for doing this was that they did not have the ability to provide separate but equal lodging for Black nurses. And they continued this policy even as the military grew more and more desperate for nurses. So by 1918, the Red Cross had dropped its race restrictions on membership. Black women could and did join the Red Cross as nurses. So the Red Cross had a whole pool of trained nurses who had signed up to volunteer and who were eager to serve their country. The first Black woman to become a Red Cross nurse was from North Carolina. And despite having extensive experience and strong educational credentials, she was initially denied because of her race. Nevertheless, she persisted, and in 1918, she was accepted as the first African-American in the Red Cross nursing service. And after admittance to the Red Cross, Nurse Elliott signed up for and then was refused by the Army Nurse Corps. Her white colleagues were all automatically awarded Red Cross pins that allowed them to transfer to the Corps and help with the war effort. Elliott's pin arrived late and displayed 1A, designating her as the first African-American nurse and thus unable to join. Elliot refused to be defeated, and she contributed to the war effort through nursing soldiers and their families at a cantonment camp in Tennessee. And when the Spanish flu pandemic hit Tennessee in the fall of 1918, Elliot was instrumental in nursing her community. She even learned to drive, taught herself to drive so that she could go from house to house and take care of people. She herself eventually contracted the disease, and it left her with permanent heart damage. So instead of calling upon the pool of trained and experienced African-American nurses, the military decided they would try and recruit student nurses who could work as nurses' aides. And they decided to start their own military nurse training program to grow their own nurses, which of course would take time and money when it would have been faster to accept nurses from the ready-made pool. Finally, in the last few months of the war, they tried an experiment with Black nurses, calling up 2 groups of 9 whom they sent to camps in Illinois and Ohio to care for Black troops. These nurses arrived in Camp Sherman, Ohio. So these particular ones you see in this picture are the nurses that were sent to Camp Sherman, Ohio on November 13th, 2 days after the armistice. So they sent them to treat victims of the Spanish flu, and all accounts, all the reports that went up said that the nurses did an excellent job and were well liked by the staff and patients. But of course, by then, the war was over. So back to Southport, and March of 1918, when the first 6 nurses arrived. So Chief Nurse Nellie was the exception. She was from Denver, but the rest of the women were from the eastern part of the United States, and 2 were from North Carolina. So I always wonder about the dynamics of a group like this, being thrust together from so many different backgrounds and locations, and how would they get along? So we can see that 4 of the women were practically the same age, but one nurse, Anna Loveland, was considerably older than everyone else. She was 47 years old. She was even older than the chief nurse, who was 33. Now, Nurse Loveland had been a nurse for a long time. She had also served in the Spanish-American War as a nurse before the military had its own nursing program. So she'd never been actually in the military before, but she had a lot of experience and knowledge that the other nurses could learn from. So I really hope that they recognized that and they were respectful of her. And the other nurse that I worry about is Bertha Jost. So Bertha was an American citizen. She came to Fort Caswell from New Jersey, but her family had moved to the United States when she was 2 years old, and she was born in Germany. And there was a lot of anti-German feelings going on at that time due to the war. People stopped speaking German in their homes. People changed their names to sound less German. Sauerkraut was called Liberty cabbage. Frankfurters became hot dogs, and hamburger became Salisbury steak. German people were treated with suspicion because they might be spies. So again, I hope that Nurse Jost was treated kindly by the other nurses. Another thing that I spent some time worrying about were these 6 young women being alone on the fort with 1,200 to 1,500 men who knew they would soon be heading off to war. But after investigating further, I realized the situation was a little different than I had originally imagined it. So first of all, I learned that several of the officers' wives and families actually lived at the fort. So you can see right there, those are officers' quarters that lined the parade ground. There were other women living on the island with them. And in addition, there was what was known as a hostess house on the base, which was a building where women from Southport and Wilmington and any place else could spend some time when they were visiting. So the women couldn't very well spend all their time walking around the parade ground. They couldn't go to the men's barracks or to their tents. So they built a little facility for visiting. The other thing I learned is that many of these men were assigned as entire units. So there was a company from Charlotte, from Fayetteville, from Raleigh, and other cities in North Carolina. So since they were so close, their wives, girlfriends, and parents would come to visit them, generally traveling by train to Wilmington and then taking the steamship down from there on a Sunday. So, and then some wives and sweethearts even relocated temporarily to Southport or to Wilmington so they could be near their husbands and boyfriends. So the nurses all worked and trained together at Caswell. Then after about 4 months, one of the nurses, Debbie Bell, was sent overseas to France. That's her going to France. And then it appears she had performed bravely while she was there because she earned the Serbian Cross. The day after Debbie left, another nurse arrived to take her place. And over the next 2 months, 6 more nurses arrived at Fort Caswell, bumping the number of nurses up to 12 plus the head nurse. So it's likely that some of the more experienced nurses would have started to leave, like Dovey did, going to overseas assignments. But in the fall of 1918, an enemy attacked the barricades of Fort Caswell. And despite their mortar guns and their submarine mines and all of their weaponry, the soldiers at Fort Caswell were helpless in its path. One by one, they succumbed to this unrelenting enemy, and one by one, the nurses of Fort Caswell stepped in to rescue them. The enemy, of course, was what was known as the Spanish flu. It had arrived in Wilmington on a troop transport bringing soldiers back from France. The first case in Wilmington was reported on September 19th. Almost immediately, Colonel Chase declared a quarantine of the base. All R&R was canceled. The steamship named Wilmington was not permitted to make mail stops. Despite these precautions, over the next few weeks, 500 soldiers got sick. So the entire camp had only been designed to accommodate about 400 soldiers. And the men had been busy building extra barracks and a YMCA and a hostess house, along with learning how to drill and march and use the weaponry. But they hadn't thought to expand the hospital. So the overflow went onto porches and tents. But since one of the few treatments that was known for Spanish flu was fresh air, they probably sought to take advantage of Southport's well-known salubrious breezes. So I just want to mention this photo and the next few pictures of the based on Spanish flu were not taken at Fort Caswell like the other pictures that I showed you. These were taken at other base hospitals and emergency hospitals from that time period. So the treatment for the Spanish flu was much more nurse-centered than doctor-centered. There was just very little the medical profession could do to treat the men. Generally, they treated the symptoms and provided support, and they just allowed enough time for the patient's own body to find a cure. Before long, the nurses learned how to predict the course of the disease. So there were those who died from the actual virus, and they went very suddenly. They might have a cough in the morning, begin to turn blue by the afternoon, and be dead by nightfall, which is why they called it the Blue Death. Then there were those who lingered. Their bodies fought back against the disease, but it left them with weakened lungs, and they developed pneumonia on top of the virus. And since antibiotics hadn't been invented yet, they were too weak to defend themselves. And then the third scenario was the patient that appeared to have recovered and tried to resume normal activities. And then they would find themselves back in bed, much sicker, or stricken with a heart attack from damage due to the disease. So Fort Caswell had a successful record with the treatment of the flu, and it's likely that they followed a similar routine as another camp called Camp Brooks, and who also had success with the flu. So this is the routine they followed at Camp Brooks. I'm assuming it's the same. During the day, the patients were nursed mainly outside in the fresh air and sunshine, and at night, the tent flaps were left open, with patients supplied with extra blankets and hot water bottles to stay warm. Sunshine is known to kill bacteria and viruses, and the fresh air factor was the subject of serious research until antibiotics were discovered. Patients used their own dishes and utensils, which were cleaned with boiling water after each use. Staff had to clean their hands with disinfectant after each patient contact, and there was no sharing of cups or towels or other items allowed. And the nurses all wore gowns, gloves, head coverings, and masks when they were in contact with patients. They used various methods to isolate and control interaction in the hospitals. So this included ensuring good ventilation, separation of beds, reducing the number of beds in the wards, arranging the beds so that patients' heads and foots were opposite so they'd have a further way to cough if they were going to cough on each other, and hanging sheets between the beds. Other measures included disinfection of bedding and rooms, staff disinfecting their hands with antiseptic hand solution, and the introduction of gauze masks. So this picture right here, I think is interesting. This is obviously they've got the patients on a porch. This porch separated by sheets. This porch is at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, DC. So that was the state of the art. Before the outbreak of the pandemic, medicine had made great strides in the preceding few decades, and it was actually getting a reputation for being able to cure disease. People were starting to look to the medical practices as being able to help them. But faced with the Spanish flu, however, doctors were at a loss, and they had to admit there was nothing they could do. And so what soon became evident was that nurses were the ones who could make a difference on the front lines of the disease. While there was no effective medical intervention, nursing skills could provide comfort and basic care. They monitored vital signs, they ensured proper ventilation, they did disinfecting and bathing and changing linen, they supported personal hygiene and feeding, they provided emotional support and education and more until the patient either recovered or passed away. So here's an example of men gargling with salt water to keep the flu at bay. Civilians did this too. Civilians also tried methods such as slicing onions and leaving them in the sick room to draw away germs. And then sometimes they would wear onions or garlic around their neck or put sulfur in their shoes with the idea that it would keep germs at bay. Which, when you think about it, it probably kept people at bay, and so by extension kept germs at bay. The nurses used everything in their power to fight the illness. There was no effective treatment or vaccine for Spanish influenza. Doctors experimented with different treatments that they had previously used for respiratory diseases, and that included things like quinine, camphor, whiskey, creosote with its known antiseptic properties, and even strychnine. General medicines for symptomatic treatment were used, such as calomel, castor oil, and aspirin. In 1918, there were no guidelines on the management of aspirin toxicity. There were not very many directions on the aspirin bottles about doses, and there were no recommendations for the amount of aspirin prescribed. One physician prescribed a handful of aspirin every hour. Another gave out 1,300 milligrams every hour. The American Medical Association recommended 1,000 milligrams every 3 hours or until symptoms were relieved. So the bottom line is daily doses prescribed were between 8,000 milligrams and 31,000 milligrams, which is 2 times to 8 times higher than what's recommended today. So in addition to the flu, they were probably also dealing with symptoms related to poisoning themselves with aspirin. Another very popular treatment was Vicks Vapor Rub. And Vicks had actually been invented in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1905 by a local pharmacist, because back then pharmacists could just invent medicines. The product would remain in the family's company for 80 years, and then they would sell it to Procter & Gamble. So the common treatment was they applied hot, wet cloths to the person's chest and throat and back between their shoulder blades to open up the pores. And then they would lightly dry them, and then they would apply vapor rub very thickly to those areas. And the goal was to rub it in until the skin turned red. Then they would cover the whole area with hot flannel cloths, and then the body's heat would release the ingredients. So to their credit, Vicks never came right out and said that their vapor rub could cure the Spanish flu, but they also did encourage its use under doctors' orders. So even if it didn't work, it felt like it was making a difference, and the supply just couldn't keep up with the demand. In one day, over 900,000 orders were placed, packaged, and all filled by hand. So you can see this newspaper article says, druggists still act to conserve stocks of vapor rub needed in flu districts. Influenza epidemic is decreasing in most sections, and the demand is slackening, but we are still 18,000 gross behind on orders, and it will take some time to catch up. And then down below where you can't really see it, it says 3 million jars shipped in October alone. So with the sales rising, the year before the flu, total sales of vapor rub was $900,000. The year of the flu, it tripled to $2.9 million. And it quickly became sort of an icon. And as more orders came in, the company had to expand. They had to add night shifts. And so they actually helped the economy because a lot of teachers had been displaced. People couldn't work because of the flu. So they found jobs at the factory after their schools were closed. And soldiers returning for World War I also were able to find employment at the Vicks Vapor Rub factory. So to many persons at that time, remembering the horrors of the pandemic, they said Vicks Vapor Rub saved America. So whether it was by planning or accident, Fort Caswell ended up well staffed for the flu pandemic. They had 6 doctors and 12 nurses. The Wilmington Morning Star pointed out that at times the fort had more medical staff than all of Wilmington, despite a much smaller population. And it was probably inevitable that some of the medical staff got ill. At least one of the soldiers who died at Caswell was a hospital corpsman, and one of the nurses came down with the flu as well. She was a local girl from Charlotte, North Carolina, and the newspapers tracked her progress. Fortunately, she made a full recovery, and by mid-November, she was healthy enough to leave for an assignment overseas in France. Despite the best efforts of the nurses, between 7 and 10 of the 500 men died at Fort Caswell from the flu. One man, Sergeant Robert Guy Farmer, was buried here at the Smithfield Burying Ground. Sergeant Farmer, who was 32 when he passed away, was married to a local girl, Katie Piver, who was only 24 when her husband died. She was the mother of 3 children, ages 3 and 2, and then a baby named after his father. The Wilmington newspaper noted that some Southport women came over to the fort to help with nursing. So I'm hopeful that word got back to Robert Farmer's wife that he was sick and that she was able to come over and spend some time taking care of him before he passed away. Sadly, just 5 months after his father passed away, their baby, also named Robert Farmer, passed away in the 3rd wave of influenza that swept through the US during the winter of 1919. So the flu had pretty much run its course at Fort Caswell by the end of October, but the so-called Spanish flu was still not quite finished with Caswell yet. Based on their success with managing the flu and the unique ability of Colonel Chase to speak Spanish, another group of men were soon sent to the fort to recover. In 1918, the US government began bringing Puerto Rican men from the sugarcane fields of Puerto Rico to Fayetteville, North Carolina to help construct Camp Bragg, or as it's now known, Fort Bragg. They were offered free transportation, housing, affordable meals, and pay of 35 cents an hour. But the men were unprepared for the North Carolina weather. They didn't have appropriate clothes, they were given cramped, uninsulated housing, and of course, there were unfamiliar germs. So when the flu pandemic arrived, many contracted the disease. A cemetery was established at Fort Bragg to inter these men, and it later became known as the Main Post Cemetery. And due to the limited information the Army had about the men, it's not clear whether their families in Puerto Rico were ever notified of their deaths or about what had happened to them. About this time, a transport ship, the City of Savannah, arrived in Wilmington with 2,000 more Puerto Rican men on their way to work at Fort Bragg. Now, coincidentally, peace talks had begun in Europe, and the government realized the war was going to be coming to an end. So they decided to just turn the ship around and send the workers back to Puerto Rico. But before they could do that, influenza broke out on the ship. Health officials transported 200 of the sickest men to the hospital at Fort Caswell and sent the remaining men back home. So the patient's situation was made worse because they didn't speak English and those around them didn't speak Spanish. Fort Caswell had been a segregated whites-only military base. There were no nurses to care for these men. But amazingly, the Red Cross found a nurse to care for them. Her name was Lena Wright Jason. She was born in Delaware, but she had grown up in Puerto Rico after her Presbyterian missionary family had moved there when she was a child. Lena was a graduate of the Presbyterian Nursing Hospital in San Juan, and she had offered her services to the military when she first arrived, but she had been turned down. So she had been attending an African-American women's college in Concord, North Carolina, when the flu broke out. So she's one of those women in that picture, but again, we don't know which one because it wasn't labeled individually. She left her studies to respond to a desperate plea for African-American nurses to help with the pandemic in Wilmington. And when news of the Puerto Rican victims became known, she volunteered to help. Nurse Jason was fluent in Spanish and English and understood the culture of Puerto Rico. She could offer nursing care, translation assistance, and emotional connection to the sick and frightened men. With Nurse Jason's care, some of the men recovered well enough to return to their homes in Puerto Rico. And I just want to read this article here. It says the Red Cross was hostess at luncheon at the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory yesterday to Colonel A.W. Chase of Fort Caswell and others in the military service who were in the city. Colonel Chase, on his return to the fort, was accompanied by Miss Lena Jason, a registered Red Cross nurse who will aid in treating the Puerto Ricans in the hospital there. Miss Jason spent 15 years in Puerto Rico, speaks Spanish fluently, and will be of great assistance in treating the islanders who are still in the hospital. And then one other article says, in answer to a telegram sent by the women of the Military Relief Committee, she left and came to Wilmington and is now, this is a section of a larger article, is now at Fort Caswell and is doing splendid work, both as an interpreter and nurse. Lena Jason is doing this as a service to her government at the risk of losing the time at school, thereby losing the credits necessary to finish her course. She has made a noble sacrifice, but is satisfied in the knowledge that she is performing an invaluable service to the government and to the unfortunate Puerto Ricans, some who are paying with their lives and fearful penalty of leaving home, also in the service of the government, unprepared for the change in the climate and who contracted pneumonia from exposure. So I'm really impressed with these articles and I really wanted to highlight them. First, it's talking about a woman doing a great sacrifice in service to her country, which you don't see very often. It doesn't, this is extremely unusual for the times, it doesn't once mention her race. Normally you would see an article that would, mention that she was not white. And also the Puerto Ricans, it doesn't mention it mentions they're from Puerto Rico, but it doesn't highlight the fact, and it says that they are also doing a service to their country. So I was pretty amazed by the articles, and I was pleased to see them getting some credit for their sacrifice. So sadly, 28 of the men passed away from the virus, and their bodies were sent to Wilmington, where they were interred in the National Cemetery. And you can see their markers today. They can be identified by the words Employee USA on the inscription. None of the others say employee. So gradually, Southport adjusted to the new normal of the pandemic. And this is a picture from the fall of 1918, which gives an idea of what life was like during the pandemic. So we see two little girls playing in front of the Army-Navy Club. Now, it's possible that they're out playing because their school is closed. We know that due to the flu, school was shut down for several weeks. We also see a guard out front, perhaps limiting the number of people who could enter, since it was known to be a crowd disease. And then we can also see a woman sitting in one of the windows looking out, perhaps to get some air, and perhaps because there wasn't much happening on the inside due to the flu and not too many people there. If you look closely, it's hard to see what this is, but this is a close-up of the picture, and you can see that the guard is wearing a mask to ward off the flu. And the woman in the window is wearing a mask as well. So it's likely that because the people of Southport acted quickly and took the flu seriously, they were spared a lot of the death that was seen in the rest of the state. And it's ironic that while so many families were worried about their sons going off to war, so many more people died back home from the epidemic. So 828 North Carolinians died from combat injuries in World War I. Nearly 14,000 died from the Spanish flu, most of them in a single 6 to 8 week period in the fall of 1918. And so the flu passed and the war ended almost simultaneously. A few months later, Nurse Susie Williams returned to the US aboard the SS Leviathan. She could relax a little more on this trip, knowing that there were no subs in the water, there was no war waiting for her when she arrived in port. And upon her return to the States, Nurse Williams chose to remain in New York, and she worked as a private nurse. And like several of the nurses who served at Fort Caswell, she never married. Over 200 active duty nurses succumbed to the Spanish flu during the pandemic. Fortunately, all of the Caswell nurses survived. Now, 5 of the nurses finished out their assignments at Fort Caswell, and then they left military service. 5 others went on overseas assignments for the military and stayed for another 1 to 3 years. 2 made a career in the Army and worked there till they retired. And the last 2 nurses had a really interesting story. Anna and Faye met in nurses training, and then they served their Army duty together. They served at Fort Caswell and then at Camp Lee, Virginia. And then they left the Army, and apparently they were not too happy with their experience. It kind of left a bad taste in their mouth. But about a year later, Faye White, said that a friend, and I'm assuming it was Anna, convinced her that service in the Navy would be different. So she decided to give it a try, and the 2 women re-enlisted. They enlisted in the Navy this time, and they served most of their careers together, and they were assigned to places like Haiti and the Philippines. So Anne retired from the service when she was 46 and went into private nursing. But Faye continued her Navy career. During World War II, she served in the South Pacific. She worked her way up through the ranks, eventually becoming a commander. In 1945, she became the first Navy nurse to receive the Bronze Star. Newspapers across the nation used her image and her age and her service to promote the purchase of Liberty loans. She retired from the military in 1947 at the age of 53, which at last left her free to get married, which she did, marrying for the first time at the age of 60. She and her husband had 22 years together before his death. Faye and Anna remained lifelong friends, and Faye and her husband attended Anna's funeral in 1972, which was just 4 years before Faye's husband also passed away. Faye herself lived to be 99 years old. She always looked back on her 30 years in the service as a worthwhile sacrifice for her country. And all of the nurses at Fort Caswell sacrificed a great deal for their service, working at half the pay of the soldiers whose lives that they were saving. None of them ever had children of their own. Only 8 ever married. They had to choose between their careers and their marriage, as married women were not allowed to serve. So you may be wondering what happened to our doughboy, Russell Ernst, who wrote letters to his sweetheart about the conditions at Fort Caswell. Ernst served at Fort Caswell from mid-1917 through May 1918, and from there he was sent to New York and then on to France. He came home following the war in February 1919. He and Helen had originally started writing to each other simply as friends, but over the course of the war, their feelings deepened, and they married in December of 1919, about 10 months after Russell returned from overseas. They were married for nearly 60 years until Russell's death at the age of 86. The couple had 1 daughter, and it was her descendants who donated his letters to the North Carolina archives. And just so you know that Ernst didn't spend all of his time complaining, here's what he had to say about the volunteers of the Red Cross. He wrote, "We boys appreciate deep in our hearts more than we shall ever be able to tell the great work that the Red Cross ladies have done for us. It may seem a small thing to hand a fellow a sandwich and a cup of coffee with a smile and a few words of cheer, but by doing so, the Red Cross has won the love and highest esteem of all American soldiers." So the Southport nurses, along with millions of other American women, made a real difference in the winning of World War I. And these women were well aware of the irony that while they were helping to win the war that was supposed to make the world safe for democracy, they themselves were not allowed to participate in this country's democratic process. By the end of the war, President Woodrow Wilson had finally come to see the inherent unfairness of the situation as well. He said that his change in views was in large part due to the contribution of the nearly 9 million American women who supported the war effort, either by joining the Red Cross, backfilling for the men who were serving overseas, or serving themselves as ambulance drivers, telephone operators, and nurses, and that all of that service changed his mind about including women in the vote. So in September 1918, he again addressed Congress, and in part his words were, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege?" So the 19th Amendment, which granted voting rights to women, was ratified in August of 1920. The following 4th of July, Southport held a pageant to celebrate. So you can see these women are Southport women, and they're standing in front of Franklin Gallery. And in the annual 4th of July parade that year, veterans from the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and World War I all marched down Moore Street while their neighbors looked on and cheered. And the Southport nurses marched right along beside them. So I'd like to thank the family of Private Arthur Red Ferguson for the pictures from Caswell, the family of Sergeant Russell Ernst and Helen Penny Ernst for the letters, the Friends of the Fort Caswell Rifle Range, and the Stateport pilot for all the pictures and information that I showed. And if you want to learn more about Brunswick County in the Great War, I suggest you look into this book that has recently been written and published by Norma and Amy Eckerd. And I think Norma is on the call, hopefully. And if she's here, Norma, are you here? If you are, oh, there she is. Take your mic off mute. You're on mute, Norma. Norma is the president of the Friends of, can you know how to do it? She's the president, I'll let her figure that out. She's the president of the Friends of the Fort Caswell Rifle Range, is a nonprofit that she started with her husband and her daughter, and they've done extensive work on recovering and the rifle range that's on Fort Caswell, raising awareness, and they have a website, and you figured it out, Norma? And they've written and published a book. There we go.
There we go. Good job. You did a good job.
Is there anything you'd like to say about the organization or where people can get the book if they want?
Yes, we still have a problem, you know, it's a pandemic, so it causes problems. We don't have bookstores close by, so we have our number, our phone number, and that flyer that you showed for people to get in touch with us. We're still selling books, about 2 a week. We've sold about, I had to reorder the hardbacks because they were sold out, and we sold 50 of those and 50 of the softbacks. So we're doing fine with the sales in this pandemic age that we're going through. I'm meeting with Brian Hemphill down at Fort Caswell. They're going to purchase some books and put them on display in the small, where they have a store, they sell things, which I haven't seen yet, so I'll see you on Friday. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to once again plug the book. We get lots of nice reports from people. They enjoy it.
All right, we'll put the little flyer that I had, I'll put that on our Facebook page so that if you guys are interested, you can get it from our post on our Facebook. So does anybody have any questions for Norma or for me about the presentation? Okay. Norma, you're on mute again. You're on. You have to unmute.
There we go.
Well, I'm sorry, what were you saying?
I said our website has over 9,000 hits in the year, but they're up to about 400 a month now. So that's pretty good too. You can go there and find out any information that you need.
Yeah, there's a lot of information. There's even more information about these the nurses there. So,
Yes.
Okay. Well, if there's no questions, then we'll be done now. Next week, we will be having our general meeting, which is in the evening, and our guest speaker will be Bill Purpose and his wife Kathy, and they will be talking about the Amuse You theater. So it should be a presentation. And I'll just mention, because it's in the month, on the first Tuesday of April, we move into the April programs, Travis Gilbert from Baldhead will be doing a historical character portrayal, and he will be portraying Sonny Dutcher. So it should be a fun presentation. That's the first Tuesday of April for our Living Voices program. All right. Thank you, everybody. See you soon.